Video games are becoming more complex than ever before. From humble beginnings with just 2 lines knocking a ball back and forth, video games can now create entire worlds approaching photorealistic visual fidelity that span miles in every direction, with dozens if not hundreds of hours of content to explore. RPGs specifically have pushed the complexity of video game environments ever forward. From telling crazy narratives in JRPGs, player expression in immersive sims, or the dizzying complexity of searching for more loot in dungeon crawlers and MMOs, RPGs as a genre tend to present some of the most expansive and demanding systems in all of video games. However, for all the massive strides video games have made over the last few decades, the biggest problem is that they necessarily have to limit the toolset available at the player's disposal to get things done. When you play a video game, you are limited in interacting with the game to how your character has been pre-assigned to do so by the game's developers. You have a limited moveset, you can only do certain techniques in the game that the developers have come up with beforehand. When you want to interact with characters and story segments, you have pre-assigned statements that you can use and pre-assigned actions you can take. Everything has to be done within the boundaries that the developers have designed for you because you're interacting with a machine, a scripted preset of options, and you cannot go beyond those options without breaking the game in some way, usually via a glitch or some other oversight the developers actively wanted to prevent you from doing. The most successful video games that feel the most immersive are the ones that present the image of a vast and living world full of choice, while at the same time subtly railroading the player through things like storytelling and environmental cues to coax them into only wanting to do a small handful of things in the current situation, and then presenting the player with those choices. When all the options are covered, a game world can feel immersive and alive, but that very sensation can be broken as soon as the player thinks of an idea or solution to a problem that the developers didn't plan for, and what was an immersive world is betrayed to be a mere mishmash of polygons and scripted sequences. A genre that people rarely complain feels limited is, ironically, one that has very little options: fighting games. This is because a fighting game is a one-on-one combat system, and the only thing you really want to do when you sit down and play a fighting game is beat the crap out of the other guy on the other side of the screen. And the game gives you tons of ways of doing that. You never really feel like you're starved for options in a fighting game because the entire experience is crafted to make you feel like you only want to do one singular thing. You never play Street Fighter and are like, man, I wish I could really just talk it out with M. Bison. Because the entire design of the game is on skillful combat. Its narrow focus on cultivating a single element of interaction primes the player's desires to never wander beyond the sole system it's been designed to provide. On the other hand, the much more diverse experience provided by an RPG or an immersive sim means the player is constantly thinking about their breadth of options as they settle into the role-playing element of the role-playing game. Due to this wider palette of player expression inherent in the genre, there are inevitably times when a player is like, man, I wish I could really have tried a diplomatic option talking to this character, or why couldn't I use the item in this way? Or if only that door actually led somewhere. When the game doesn't have those scenarios planned for, the believability of the world diminishes. And it's here, where video games are the most strained, that pen and paper role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons shine the brightest. Because the biggest strength of pen and paper role-playing games is that they break free of the biggest restraint of video games in general, the mechanics and the boundaries of the game itself. While Dungeons & Dragons has a rule set, these systems are there to merely guide a dynamic experience, not govern a predetermined path. In a video game, players interface with a static system and can respond to what the game presents. In D&D, the game is the dungeon master, another human being. Because the game is also a human, the game can respond to players just as much as the players respond to the game. The DM can respond in real time to anything the players can think up, generating entirely new experiences on the fly in response to whatever is currently happening. With an actual person controlling the mechanisms of the game, players are no longer bound to a limited set of responses in conversation, or a predetermined set of combat mechanics, or a small set of preset narrative choices. Literally anything the players can conceive of, the Dungeon Master, the game, can facilitate via the D20 dice system and surrounding mechanics. As cliche as it sounds, the only limit in D&D and its ilk is the imagination present at the table. Of course, D&D has its own limitations. While an imaginative group can make for a near magical experience, your mileage playing tabletop will vary wildly depending on the people at the table with you. If all the party you're playing with wants to do is just run into a dungeon, roll dice, and slash things, they'd be better off leaving the table and playing something like Diablo, because combat, or anything that is more visceral and reactive, is far better suited to the realm of video games. It's nearly impossible to get the same kind of cathartic swordplay in something like a Devil May Cry at a slow, turn-based dice rolling situation like Dungeons & Dragons. And if you aren't the kind of person with an active imagination, it can be hard to get immersed in a bunch of graphs, character sheets, and dice like you can in a more tangible world such as Skyrim. However, as technology continues to get more and more advanced, and AI and algorithmic models get more complex, it seems inevitable that, eventually, the flexibility of D&D's dynamic role-playing will collide with the cathartic moment-to-moment gameplay of video games. We've seen Google create AI that can book appointments in real time with realistic speech patterns, AI that can generate entire articles that read nearly indistinguishable from a human being, and artificial speech synthesis gets more and more convincing with every passing year. Once matured, I can't help but imagine these technologies allowing for a kind of RPG that can assess, respond to, and generate dynamic experiences far more akin to the sprawling choice of a clever DM, rather than the smoke and mirror guided approximation of choice we have in even the best video games of today.